Good morning. Welcome to the special council meeting at the town of Qualicum Beach. I call this meeting to order, and I just want to acknowledge that we are in the traditional territory of Coast Salish people, in particular Qualicum First Nation. So with the agenda, there have been requests to change under bylaws number 1 to number 2. So the zoning amendment for 230 2nd Avenue West would go first. Is that okay with council? Okay, so any other changes to the agenda? Then the agenda is adopted as by consent. The minutes. We have minutes from the May 24th and June 15. Any errors or omissions? Ms. Svensson.
Thank you, Mayor Westbrook. There's just one correction to be made on page 6 of the package. Councillor Vanderbalk was not in attendance at the May 6 event at the Legion, so we'll make that correction.
Councillor Harrison.
Yeah, so maybe we can do it at the next regular meeting, but there were the two motions I said in the previous regular meeting that I'd like us to reconsider. So I won't do it here just because I think there's a timeline for some people and I'd like to get the work done first, but I just want to highlight that.
Thank you. So then the agenda is adopted. Sorry, the minutes are approved by consent. Bylaws, Mr. Sales.
Thank you, Mayor Westbrook. The next item on the agenda, as amended by council, would be the development permit and zoning amendment application for 230 2nd Avenue West. And if I could please have that up on the screen. This is a zoning amendment and DP application for a property that proposes to construct a mixed-use building with ground floor commercial, 4 short-term vacation rentals on the 2nd floor, and 1 dwelling unit on the top floor. 3 of the short-term vacation rentals also have lock-off bedrooms, which would be accessible independent of the rest of the dwelling unit. Next slide.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, thank you. This slide shows the location of the property. It's up near the end of 2nd Avenue, near Jones Street. Next slide. These are perspective renderings from different angles showing the building. So as you see on the ground floor, it is commercial. There's some intention to create some patio space, and that is in line with the town's official community plan in terms of activating that front and making it pedestrian friendly and inviting to go inside. The applicant is considering the development of a tapas bar, I believe it was, but the zoning would permit any of the zoning classifications allowed currently in the commercial zone, so it could potentially go to other retail or restaurant uses. Next slide. This is a cross-section of the building. The important thing to note here is that the 2nd and the 3rd floor both extend further towards the back of the property than the ground floor, because that is used for parking. So it's essentially the majority of the parking lot is covered by the 2nd and 3rd floor. A portion of it is fully exposed. Next slide. This is the landscape plan that was submitted at the time of application. This shows the parking lot in the rear. It doesn't show the overhang of the upper floors, but as you recall from the last slide, those floors would extend further back. One thing I do want to note on this site plan, because it may come up later, is the relationship between this building and the adjacent building, which is Villa Rose. The Villa Rose is constructed where a portion of the building is essentially right next to the property line, and so it actually has to have a concrete block wall, the firewall, so there's no windows or any interruptions to that firewall on that side. And the applicant proposes to use this to, I would say, mutual advantage in terms of locating some of the mechanical equipment in that area, and also ensuring that there's no windows, that would interfere with the privacy of the adjacent neighbors. So there has been some questions about the location of the heat pumps that are proposed on this building. So the architect has confirmed that they would be in one of 2 locations. So one would be adjacent to the concrete wall on that side next to Villa Rose. Some of the heat pumps would be there, and some of them would be potentially up on the roof. And the architect has assured there would be no heat pumps adjacent to the windows of the adjacent property. Next slide. So the recommendation at this time is for this application to be read a 3rd time, the zoning amendment to be read a 3rd time. There are some additional motions that were given to staff by Councillor Skipsey, and I did include them on the screen up here on the next slide, if you would. Thank you. Just in case council wants to refer to them during discussions, but the staff recommendation is to proceed with third reading. Thank you, Mayor Westbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Sales. Just for procedurally, to make changes at this point is possible. Would you explain perhaps the proper procedure for making changes as suggested by this list of motions?
Thank you, Mayor Westbrook. So the important thing to consider at this point in a zoning amendment is that this is not the time to be changing land use, right? So if council were to propose changes that change the land use on a property, either increasing the density or even decreasing the density, those types of changes are potentially red flags in a zoning amendment. If there are aspects of the development that council would like to refine, or perhaps include some specific parameters around the way that it operates in the future, that is certainly within council's purview. You can make those specifications at this time. I would note that the applicant has gone through this process and gotten to this point and may not have considered some of those additional requirements that council imposes. So yes, those types of requirements are lawful. It's up to council to determine whether they're appropriate to introduce late in a development process, but that is entirely within your discretion. Thank you.
Thank you. Could I have a motion for third reading? Councillor Harrison, Councillor Young, discussion. Would like to start. Councillor Skipsey.
Well, I guess I'll start. Why not? I am going to be consistent in my approach that I don't think allowing short-term rentals should be permitted until the town has a policy, a framework in place, and a plan on how they are to be managed, and not proceed on basically a site-specific approach. As pointed out by one of our residents, it's important that we clarify our approach for the benefit of residents, existing tourist accommodation operators, potential developers, potential lenders, and the traveling public. We need to be considering what could occur as intentions and circumstances change over time, and put in the appropriate controls or restriction in place by covenant at this point in time. As pointed out by Councillor Vandervalk previously, there are different short-term rental options. There's ones where the entire building is rented out or an unit, or there's ones where there's a secondary or accessory use. So my preference would be to wait till we have a plan in place. However, it would seem the majority of council is in favor of advancing this proposal now. So I have proposed a number of compromises, I feel are compromises in how a short-term rental could be managed. I've looked at some of the materials from other municipalities as to their approaches, and so that's where some of this wording has come from. I do have one question based on some of the input we received from the public hearing, and that is, was there ever shadow studies done for this development?
Mr. Sales.
Thank you. Through the chair to Councillor Skipsey, yes, a shadow study was provided as a part of the application.
Okay, well, I would, I guess, like to move this, my recommendation. Actually, the second recommendation, the one at the bottom, that council directs staff to prepare a report with options to increase the rate for cash and lieu parking. That would be a notice of motion. I plan to bring that forward to the next regular council meeting, so it's not part of this block.
So would you like to start from the top, number one, and
Sure.
work our way down? We'll do them one at a time. And at each one, I'll ask our Director of Planning to comment on those. Go ahead.
Okay, so the first one, that the building must achieve step code 4 in the BC Energy step code, and I know that now step code 3 is a minimum, so this is asking for a bit more than what's minimally required. And I do recall being at the public information meeting and hearing from the architect that there were plans to do some additional things like extra insulation on the roof, or perhaps solar panels, or a green roof was, I think, in the discussion at one time. So my understanding is it's not a huge leap sometimes from step code 3 to 4. So I would propose that we're thinking ahead and requiring a step code 4.
I should have asked, is there a seconder for that? Councillor Van der Valk. Okay, now we can discuss that one. Councillor Harrison?
Just through the chair to staff, there's 2 different step codes for different types of buildings. Which type of building is this? Is this the one with the 5-step step code or the 4-step step code?
Thank you, Mayor Westbrook. So this would be a Part 9 building, so it is in the prescriptive part of the code. However, I did have an exchange with the architect yesterday, and there's some aspects to this building that make it unique and not similar to some of the other Part 9 buildings that are completely residential that council would consider. So the application being a mixed commercial and residential use where restaurant is one of the proposed uses on the ground floor, the ventilation requirements for restaurants make it much more challenging to meet some of the energy step code requirements. So the architect has clearly stated that step code 4 is the target. However, some of those requirements make it such that they would like to not have a requirement for step code 4 because this is a unique building. And the discussion will be different, I think, when we consider purely residential buildings, because they have completely different ventilation requirements and they're inherently more energy efficient.
Thank you. Personally, I think if we're going to go down step code 4, that it would be fair and consistent with, for you and the public and council, that we have a policy saying from now on we'd like all the new construction to be targeting step code 4. But hearing the comments about commercial is difficult to do, and bringing in at this point, I don't think I can support this at this point, but I certainly would support a policy that says for every new development in the future, we're going to target step code 4. Any other comments? Councillor Van der Valk and then Councillor Harrison.
Yeah, I think Mr. Sales just said that the plan was originally for a tapas bar, but that may change and it may be a different commercial use. So would that choice be predicated on whether it has to be a step code 4 or not? Do you have any indication? Like, that's something that is new to me anyways, that they might not have the restaurant.
Through the chair to Councillor Van der Valk, I'm not aware of any indication that they don't want to do the restaurant. I just wanted to be completely transparent with council that the zoning that council is considering does not specifically restrict this to a restaurant use. So in the future, if the tapas bar isn't successful and the commercial space is converted to a future use, I don't want anyone to be surprised that that is a potential.
Thank you. Councillor Harrison.
Yeah, and just the inverse of that is like Lefties, for example, on the corner of Memorial and the example of Lefties on the corner of Memorial and Fern, which could become office space. Office space and restaurants are all the same commercial zoning. So there's a pretty broad range of commercial activity. I do think too is if where the mayor is going is that we specify residential construction, just because there are nuances with commercial construction in our downtown that sometimes things don't line up right. But that for me seems like a pretty good goal. Just hearing that, it kind of makes sense when you hear it that there's ventilation requirements for a restaurant. That makes a lot of sense. So maybe not for this building. It sounds like they're already doing a lot of the things we'd like them to do anyways. They're installing heat pumps, they're installing EV chargers, they're doing a lot of things that are more environmentally friendly. So I think to have a hard requirement would be a mistake. To maybe change it to say something more aspirational, like the equivalent of step 4 for the residential units. That would be something I think is kind of fair, but I also understand that the more you get that language in, it just creates a little bit of a complication. I think there's a bit of good faith we should have with this, given what we see right now from the development.
Councillor Van der Valk. And then
I'm just wondering if step 4 is not specified, do we have an indication of, is the developer definitely going to put in a green roof and/or solar panels?
Mr. Sales.
Yes, thank you. Through the chair to Councillor Vanderbalk. A green roof certainly was indicated on the plans. As an alternative, the architect has stated that they're considering solar photovoltaic, so that might be the direction that they go. So I can't completely confirm one way or the other, but there is an intention to do one of the two.
Councillor Young.
I agree with Mayor Westbrook that it's a little too late in the process for us to start changing some of the policy requirements. I'm all for green initiatives, and it's something that we should discuss and make amendments to our OCP and do that then before a developer presents, have spent their time and money on presenting a proposal.
Okay, just a question. If we wanted to encourage, because it sounds like they are inclined to work with Step Code 4 for the residential portion, would it be appropriate, would it make any sense for us to say that we encourage the developer to reach Step Code 4 for the residential development? Would that be an appropriate thing? Because then between now and adoption, there may be some indication of what they were planning on doing, because we heard about some of the things that were planned, which sounds really good, but we're not forcing them to. We want to work with them and do it on their own initiative. So is that a possibility?
Thank you, Mayor Westbrook. So one nuance here is that when energy modelers consider a building, they consider the entire building. So they wouldn't consider the residential portion in isolation of the commercial. So the architect has stated that were the residential to be considered by itself without the commercial, it would likely achieve Step 4 as they're currently proposing it. So that's not an imposition. However, there's no way to prove it. So if council wants to state an intention or an encouragement to target Step Code 4, there's nothing wrong with an aspirational recommendation, but requiring that for a portion of the building wouldn't really be feasible to monitor.
We've had a good discussion on this particular one. Are you ready for the question? Councillor Skipsey.
Well, I didn't have all of that information that the Director of Planning has provided this morning when I was preparing this motion. But to Councillor Vandervalk's comment, would, in place of this, requiring either the PV solar on the roof or a green roof be a reasonable compromise?
Mr. Seals?
Thank you, Mayor Westbrook. Through the chair to Councillor Skipsey. Given that it was identified in previous portions of the application, it wouldn't be unreasonable to hold them to that statement.
Well, sure, if this motion fails, then I would put that forward as a further motion.
I'll call the question. Are you ready for the question? All in favor on the motion as written? Opposed? Did you get the names? Okay, thank you. If you have another motion, we'll do it at the end, Councillor Skipsey. Then the third floor residential dwelling cannot be rented for a term of less than 28 days. Perhaps you can put some context to that, Councillor Skipsey.
Okay, so the proposal that is before us is that the owner will be living on the third floor and that the short-term rentals are located on the second floor. And so this motion is to ensure that it is just the second floor, because should now the third floor be rented out, then there's implications for parking and also that perhaps somebody is not going to be on site, although this is not necessarily requiring that somebody would be on site with the short-term rentals, but it's kind of a compromise, I guess.
Thank you. Mr. Seals, comment?
This requirement wouldn't be out of line with the statements that have been made in the application, so it would just essentially hold the property owner to that commitment in the long term.
Thank you. Councillor Harrison.
Yeah, my fear here is that we're just starting to get ahead of the process that I believe is planned to do in the fall, where we're going to be reviewing short-term rentals and how they're done. So to start having, I'm assuming this would be upheld through a covenant on the property. Okay, I'm seeing a nod from our Director of Planning. If we start passing an actual policy for the whole town for short-term rentals, would we have to revisit this Section 219 covenant that was passed mere months before? And that's just sort of why I have a little bit of discomfort with this, is that we're going to be addressing this in a few months. So to get ahead of the game and start passing a covenant for one specific property to essentially start creating that policy, I'm not saying we're not going to land at a place where you have to be living on the property, but I'd hesitate to do that as a one-off without that full process first.
Thank you. I support this one. I think from the comments we heard, the owners aren't opposed to either living there themselves or having someone living there long-term. So are you ready for the question on number 2? Sorry. Oh, Councillor Young.
I don't support that. I don't feel we should govern our residents. I know of other people that live in Qualicum Beach that when they go away, they like to rent their house out for 2 weeks. And they're not running an Airbnb, but they'd like to have someone come in and look after their house and house sit their pets and whatever. So for us to make this kind of specific for this residential owner, I think it's unfair.
Thank you, Councillor Young. Any further discussion? All in favor
Nope,
on...
excuse me.
Sorry?
We don't have a seconder.
Oh, wasn't it seconded by you?
Nope.
Oh, you will second it. Okay. We have one. I thought you had your hand up, but you were raising your hand to speak. Sorry about that. So it's been moved and seconded, and we have the discussion. All in favor of number 2? Opposed? Councillor Young, Councillor Harrison. Thank you. Number 3, Councillor Skipsey.
Okay, so this is mostly related to the, well, it is related to the second floor short-term vacation rentals. So I don't know if we want to go through these individually. Okay, so that the dwellings cannot be sold separately for a minimum of 10 years.
Councillor, Mr. Sales.
Thank you, Mayor Westbrook. So what this requirement would essentially do is require that they be operated as a single block for the 10-year period. So if council feels it's appropriate or necessary for them to be managed together, then this wouldn't be unreasonable. If there's a scenario where council thinks it would be acceptable for the units to be owned by different individual investors and simply, perhaps managed together, then it wouldn't be appropriate to put on this requirement.
After your discussion with the architect and supposedly the owner's developer, was there opposition to this particular requirement?
I didn't receive a response indicating either way on this one. I think the owner would likely prefer the option to bring in other investors, to own the units separately and require that they be managed together. But that's somewhat speculative because I didn't have a definitive response on this item.
Okay, perhaps we can get that before adoption. Thank you. Further discussion. Councillor Harrison.
Is this sort of requirement in place for any other building in Qualicum Beach? I'm not aware of ever seeing this before.
Thank you, Mayor Westbrook. So there are 2 parallels I can reference. So one is that there are density bonuses available for rental, accessory residential rental units, and one of the requirements is that they be owned together with other units in the same building, so to make sure that it stays as rental for the long term. Probably the better, more relevant recent example would be for Pheasant Glen, which when council approved that, there was a block of condominiums or apartments, however you want to refer to them, and there was a requirement that those 40 units be owned together with the intention that they also be managed together. So that is a possibility. It has been done. That would have been last year that was adopted. Thank you.
But if I could, though, that was a different situation because those are all commercial units that are intended for essentially being like the hotel. That's referred to in the OCP. Here you have potentially a short-term rental and a residential unit. And so it is actually different in the types of use for those 2 different properties. So there actually isn't an analog with Pheasant Glen in that case when you actually consider the use of the land as opposed to some of the technicalities of the wording. So as a result, we're basically in a position where I can't think of a single analog in 5 years for putting these kind of restrictions on. So I'd hesitate to actually support it at this point.
Okay, did I get a seconder for that? No, you seconded for this, Councillor Van der Valk. Thank you. Discussion. Councillor Van der Valk, you go next.
Well, it's my understanding that the whole project, the idea of having the short-term vacation rentals in the building is something that is definitely, it's new to Qualicum Beach. And as Councillor Harrison mentioned, there is studies, provincial studies that are looking at this situation, but when that was mentioned in previous meetings, it was decided, well, no, we can't hold up what this project based on waiting for that study. And now it's being suggested that we can't do certain things because we haven't had the study yet. So there seems to be a bit of confusion around that. I think that if the building is being built and it's essentially as a hotel, but it has short-term vacation rentals, that they should be kept as a block because it's as a hotel. So I agree with this, this motion that they cannot be sold separately. And I would even suggest maybe just period, they cannot be sold separately and not have a time limit on it.
Thank you. Councillor Yap.
I don't think it should have a time limit. I believe these units can be sold separately. This is kind of new territory to have a boutique hotel in our downtown. It's something that the Tourism Association, the Chamber has wanted, just to promote walkability, tourism attraction, and vibrancy in our downtown core. And to restrict it to a block, we also want to have people that are able to just buy and rent. So I think this is a really unique opportunity to have an option, and let's just see where the need goes. And if someone wants to live in the downtown, they can buy in. And if they don't want to run it as an Airbnb, then so be it. But it's nice to allow the Airbnb because this is commercial zoning, and it's the Airbnb that we want to discourage in the residential areas.
Thank you. Councillor Skipson and Councillor Harrison.
Okay, so then now I have a question, is that are these units then available to be rented on a monthly basis if somebody bought them and wanted to live in them, to Councillor Young's point?
Mr. Sales, do you have an answer for that?
Yes, thank you, Mayor Westbrook. So there's no requirement in the zoning for these to be operated as short-term vacation rentals. So they could be converted to long-term residential use should the owner choose to do so in the future. The question that council is considering is just whether or not those 4 units need to be retained as one ownership block. The top unit is totally separate, so that's not a consideration in this particular motion. It's only referring to the 4 units on the second floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Harrison.
Yeah, so one of I think the confusion that's being referred to earlier is that I think if we're going to be doing a blanket set of rules for Airbnb, we should be doing it as one coherent process, not a series of one-offs. Essentially, the day before third reading, we're starting to do our Airbnb policy, and I don't think that's a way to get a good result. We might land at a place where the requirements we set as a town are very similar to this. But again, I think we should be doing that as a coherent policy which actually has a full staff report and is following best practices, as opposed to sort of doing it on the fly because it's coming up on an agenda. I don't think that's an effective way to do things. In terms of each individual units, it would be a really bizarre situation if someone sold one of the 3 units on one floor. I think that would be a very odd thing to do. I could just be on my own. But at the same time, I feel really uncomfortable doing one-off covenants essentially on a property with no precedent, when it's essentially a knee-jerk response when we have a process coming up in a few months' time.
Thank you. If they're longer term for rent or to live, we've been looking for longer term rents. So I'm not sure what the concern is about that. And again, I would like to ask if the architect has any feedback or the owners regarding this particular requirement on 3A. Was there feedback from the architect on that?
Not on this particular item.
Okay. So I'm struggling with this when I read this. I'm kind of like a free enterprise person too, and I don't know if this is getting to be over-regulated. I'm concerned about that. I haven't really looked into it, whether it happens elsewhere. I thought there was in other places where we said you can't sell the units for 10 years because of a rezoning. So didn't we have something like this in place on the corner of Beach and First?
Thank you, Mayor Westbrook. So yes, there is absolutely a precedent with regard to residential rental, saying that the units cannot be sold individually for 10 years. That's also a common requirement when it comes to the home warranty, for rental developments. I would add, in consideration of this part of the motion, that requiring that they be retained as an ownership block could be a financing issue for the owner. And because we didn't have an opportunity to discuss this one and I didn't get feedback, it's somewhat speculative, but at a broad level, there are scenarios where, especially a small-scale developer like this needs to bring in partners to actually build the building, and so there might be, an ownership of one of the units that would be required to actually construct it. So this one could have unintended consequences that we aren't necessarily considering at this time. So from a staff perspective, I would recommend not proceeding with this requirement. Thank you.
Thank you. Further discussion. Are you ready for the question? Councilor Van der Valk, sorry.
Well, again, I'm a little bit concerned about when this project first came to us. There was concern expressed that we don't have a format or a clear plan for how we're going to deal with short-term vacation rentals, and perhaps before the project proceeded, we should wait for information about that. And now, the project has gone along, and now it's come to the point where we are looking at this. It's not a straightforward situation, and we're having to look at it. It's a different type of building. So if we say that these units, the 4 units on the second floor, could be sold separately, whether there's a time limit or not, does that mean that they could be sold separately as short-term vacation rentals? So then we're running into the same situation that we have throughout the town, where people have accommodation that they don't want long-term rentals, and they're short-term rentals, whereas we need long-term rentals. And let me just gather my thoughts here.
Take your time.
I think that it's being presented as this boutique hotel idea, but it might become long-term residential, but the design is certainly based on short-term rental type units. You have lock-offs, you have very limited kitchen space. They're quite small. So I think we are mixing things up. And if we want to have some kind of framework that actually deals with the short-term vacation rentals, then this is a good compromise, as Councillor Skipsey has said, because it's not one thing or the other. It's kind of in between. It's a hybrid building, and it needs to be dealt with differently.
Thank you. Councillor Skipsey.
I guess my question would be, if we go ahead with this section 219 covenant, and then later we do our short-term rental framework and we come up with our policy and our plan, there's nothing to staff, there would be nothing restricting us from going back and revising or changing the covenant. Is that correct?
Mr. Seals.
Thank you. Through the chair to Councillor Skipsey. Changing a covenant requires authorization from the owner. So certainly, council could indicate that it's acceptable to change at a later date, but the town couldn't just go and change a covenant on someone's property.
Councillor Young.
We are dealing with this property, it's on commercial zoning. And so if anyone's going to have an Airbnb, it would be ideal to be in a commercial zoning and not in a residential area. And being that this building and all the buildings in our commercial zone allows residential up above, so it's great that you have the option, the flexibility to do Airbnb or not do Airbnb. I feel, sorry.
Thank you, Councillor Young. Any further discussion? Councillor Skipsey.
Well, I guess I'm just thinking, what if the neighbors next door started running short-term rentals in their units? I know it's not maybe permitted, or down the street or across the street. I think that, there's more control, I guess, if it's a block of units being operated by one person versus having multiple owners doing their own thing. And, I think this was proposed as a kind of in place of a boutique hotel, whereas if we start selling off units, it could be somebody's living there full-time, somebody could be living there, part-time. What happens to the lock-offs? To me, it's a slippery slope, and I think that if we're going to go ahead, we're going to, allow this, and we need to give consideration as to what the short-term rentals mean for the owner, for the neighbors, for the community.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Councillor Harrison.
Just put in perspective too, when we're discussing this, there was a presentation from the City of Vancouver, the Housing Forum, about short-term rentals. What's interesting is they have the most robust enforcement in BC, basically. Started in 2020, which coincides with the start of the pandemic, so caveat emptor with the data. But the number of short-term rentals halved for the next 3 years, and stayed pretty consistent for those 3 years. In the same period of time, the cost of rental accommodation in Vancouver increased by 30%. Between 2016 and 2021, there's about a 12% increase in the number of renter households. So yes, there is an impact on renter households, but it's not like a silver bullet that we have to restrict short-term rentals to such an extent that'll create this magic benefit for the community. And also too, in our OCP, we restrict short-term rentals in residential areas only. That's the only language in our OCP about short-term rentals. It says nothing about the commercial area of our town, which is pretty strictly delineated and pretty small. So I think when we start saying what if, we're going to be dealing with it in literally like 3 or 4 months. So I don't see what the issue is in starting to create a whole bunch of regulations now, particularly when dealing with a bank and then possibly a second bank for a project like this, they might have specific requirements where they don't have access to the collateral for the loans to get the mortgages. So they might use a unit as essentially as collateral or something. I don't know, there's all sorts of financial things which are way beyond my understanding that I don't want to create a barrier to at this point.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Councillor Van der Valk.
I just feel that when this project was first presented, it was presented as the owner would run the restaurant and would live on the entire top floor and would run the second floor as short-term vacation rentals. And I think that if we can make it clear that that's the way this proposal will be accepted and that the dwelling units are as a block, I think that that will serve us well. And as Councillor Skipsey said, if the owner, after there are further discussions about short-term vacation rentals, if they want to amend the covenant, then they are in a position to do that. So I am supportive of this motion.
Thank you. Councillor Young.
I just have to reiterate, this is a commercial zoning, so it's about doing business that's legal. And we can't restrict someone and say, oh, well, you know, you can only have that restaurant that you suggested. If they do another business on the street, that would be okay. And the same with the second floor. You know, we talk about needing homes and we talk about having Airbnbs allowed in a certain area. So Airbnbs in a commercial zone should be allowed. It's kind of common sense, because that's where you do business, is in a commercial zone. So that's why I believe there should be freedom of flexibility to do business and have this proposal rather than an empty lot in our downtown.
Thank you. Any further discussion? I will accept our staff's recommendation not to proceed with this one. And I think Councillor Young made a lot of common sense comments. So are you ready for the question? All in favor? Opposed? Did you get the names, Ms. Benson? Thank you. And 3B, a business license. Councillor Skipsey, would you like to speak to that?
No, I think it's straightforward.
Okay, have a seconder for that? Councillor Van der Valk, seconded. Discussion. Councillor Harrison.
I think this is actually a reasonable request for a short-term rental, but again, I just want it to be part of a coherent process, not just a one-off. So the only reason I'm voting against it now, but I'll be probably voting for this in 3 or 4 months' time, is just so that we're consistent with everything, because when we actually do our short-term rental policy, this is a reasonable request. But I just don't like having one-off covenants that then get duplicated by policy, because I'm fairly certain we're going to land in a place where we require this for all operations in town. And the difference of 3 or 4 months in terms of revenue, I mean, a business license is not a lot of money. So we're not losing a lot of revenue as a town. It saves us from duplicating a covenant on a property in case a future council wants to get rid of the business license provision. So I would suggest we just don't do this as a one-off, but we have that conversation soon enough, and there probably will be a requirement moving forward.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Was it seconded? Okay. So discussion on B. Any further discussion? Councillor Young.
For this, I am in favor of having a business license because it is commercial zoning and you're going to do Airbnb, and that is a business, so I would support having a business license.
Any further discussion? All in favor? Opposed, if any? Carried unanimously. Thank you. Is that correct? Yeah. Thank you. Okay. C.
Again, I think it's straightforward. Originally, I had that the owner or representative or agent must live on site, and the compromise was to say that they be available 24 hours a day.
Thank you, and I'll second that. Discussion. Councillor Harrison.
I just worry that, you know, what happens if there's a breach? What does enforcement look like? How do we enforce that? What is the consequence of the breach? What happens if there's a death in the family and they're just away for a few days and they don't answer their phone for a day because they're just quite distraught? So I just see this as something where it's a good conversation about best practices for Airbnb, but that's more a Chamber of Commerce conversation, not so much a council conversation. I can just see so many different things that can happen in life where you could be in breach of this, and then I don't know what we do as a town. How it's already been built, it's already there. What do we do in terms of enforcement? So I think as a one-off, this is not really that useful, and I'm not sure how we could enforce it anyways.
Thank you. Further discussion. Councillor Skipsey, Councillor Van der Valk.
Oh, I'll just say that in other municipalities, they actually require that the information be posted, the contact information, that it be circulated to all of the neighbors. And so I think that this is not unreasonable. If there's a party going on, and the agent or the owner can certainly have somebody act as their representative in their place.
Thank you. Councillor Van der Valk.
Thank you. Yes, I was going to say as well, if there are unforeseen circumstances that happen, then hopefully the owner would have someone else representing them and being able to look after any problems that might come up, so.
Thank you. Councillor Young.
I don't want to be seen as governing someone on how they conduct their business, but I would assume that whoever is running this project would make sure that they are available on an emergency call, or someone can answer any concerns that happen 24/7. So I trust that it would be understood. I don't feel we need to govern over it.
Thank you. Rather than assume, I think we'll make this as a reasonable request. Councillor Harrison.
I just want to point out, though, that we're landing in a place where we don't want businesses running Airbnbs. We wanted the people living in the residence. But in order for the people, the residents, to run the Airbnbs, they have to get in touch with a business to run it. So it seems to me that we're kind of doing the exact opposite of what we say we want through this. If we want it to be a friendly little neighborly on your property thing, then allow some flexibility for people to actually live their lives and manage the property.
Thank you. Was there any comment, Councillor Sales? Mr. Sales?
Yes, thank you, Mayor Westbrook. So 2 points on this one. One is that items C and E, so related to the response time as well as the number of adults per bedroom, would be extremely difficult to enforce and monitor. So to the point that I'm racking my brain as to how we would ever enforce or ticket with regard to these. So they, if anything, they would be aspirational, and as noted earlier, perhaps in best practices. So that's the first point. Second point would be that these two items are definitely the types of considerations that would be made during the development of a policy on short-term vacation rentals. So the identification of different parts of the building for different uses, that's what we're here for today. Then, regulating some of the details about the number of bedrooms, people in bedrooms, and response times, that council will definitely have an opportunity to consider those types of issues in future short-term vacation rental policy development. Thank you.
Thank you. So just for clarification, if we, in a few months, whenever we have a policy, then this can also apply to this project. The effect of that policy would apply to this.
That's correct. I think potentially the path forward would be that council adopts a policy around short-term vacation rentals, and to get a business license, that you would have to agree to a number of conditions, and these types of conditions could very well be the conditions on the license. So yes, council would have the opportunity to apply these to a building, even if council has already approved it.
Thank you. So on number C for the discussion, all in favor? Opposed? Opposed, it fails. Number D, Councillor Skipsey.
Yeah, well, because the lock-off units can be rented out individually, I felt that there should be parking provided for those units. So lock-off bedrooms would require an off-street parking stall per unit, or alternatively, a payment of $11,000, which is our current cash in lieu parking charge, if it can't be achieved on site.
Thank you. I'll second that. Discussion. Councillor Skipsey. Oh, that's all? Councillor Harrison.
Just through the chair to staff, does the current parking, so is set originally at 11 and they've reduced it to 9, because I believe there's a policy for electric vehicle charging hookups, so they have that all in place. Under our current policy, as it's currently worded, would they be responsible for any additional costs for parking?
Through the chair to Councillor Harrison, under current parking regulations, lock-up bedrooms would not require an additional stall.
Councillor Harrison.
So the issue for me then is that they gone to third reading following the policy, and then we're essentially creating a new policy at third reading. I think it's a good debate to look at that cash in lieu for parking, to start looking at some of these things, but I do think it's a bit unfair to apply it at this stage of the process instead of having had that debate maybe between first and second reading. So if we had advanced between first and second, that's a great conversation, but at this point, it's pretty late in the game, and I do kind of worry about creating a new policy a day before a third reading, and then we're going to discuss the same policy, and we might actually have a different outcome. Because I do think when we're looking at parking minimums, we actually want to move in a different direction. Instead of charging as much as we can in the downtown core, we actually want to incent less cars, make it so that you have more active transportation and bicycles and EV hookups, and make that an attractive thing for developers, not a thing they're punished for. So I wouldn't suggest we actually do this one either.
Councillor Vandervalk, Councillor Skipsey.
Yeah. Well, again, I believe that the lock-off bedrooms and requiring parking for those was brought up in previous meetings, and nothing really was resolved around that. I understand the sentiment, and a lot of the people that spoke at the public hearing had the same sentiment as, well, we shouldn't encourage more parking, the necessity for more parking stalls anyways, but I think that there's a fine balance between what is reasonable and sort of the what our CAO calls the blue sky hopes. I think that parking needs to be addressed. I think we have a shortage of parking. We have a parking problem in the town. We're doing a traffic study looking at parking, how to get more parking. And if we just say, well, we don't want to ask developers to put in additional parking, then we're at odds again between what it is that we say we want and what it is that residents need or the town needs. Already there's a lot of people that don't come to town, don't come shopping to town because they can't find parking. So if we're not asking new developments to provide parking for their development up to a level that's acceptable, then how are we giving the town more parking? So we're not a walkable town for the most part now. We have a lot of people that drive to town, so they use a vehicle to drive to town. We don't have a good transportation system. We don't have a good transit system. We don't have car share. So unless those kinds of things come into play, I think we're going to have to ask for additional parking. And also, I think it's interesting how were the number of parking stalls for any development established or calculated. For this, it was essentially 1 per unit, I believe. And yet, if we refer back to 365 First Avenue West, where there was a proposal to build a duplex, each side of the duplex, or one, either needed 1.5 or 2 cars was required, or 2 parking stalls was required. So we're sending mixed messages. And the point about lock-off bedrooms, we have no policy about lock-off bedrooms. Well, again, that's because we are going ahead with this without looking at the whole situation previously. So I'm a little frustrated myself by it because we're kind of running two things at the same time, and I think for the town we need to look at it's a separate bedroom. It can be rented separately. There will be a separate person in a separate car staying in the separate bedroom. And so they're going to need a parking spot. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Young and then Councillor Harrison.
I think in this particular area, there is lots of parking on Jones, and there is the Civic Center with the big, massive parking lot there. It is a commercial zone, and people do business in the daytime, but there's lots of parking on the street in the downtown core after like 4 o'clock, even like 3 o'clock, as early as that. And I would assume that if you have a lockup unit, are you going to be hanging around, or are you going to leave your client, your guests, in peace and quiet for enjoyment of the unit. Or I would assume that if I had a lockup unit, I would leave, or I would be gone to work in the daytime. So my car would be gone, or I may be gone on holidays because I have someone in the lockup unit. And I would, doing proper business, designate someone to look after the unit when I'm not there.
Thank you. Councillor Harrison and Councillor Skipsey.
Yeah, I would point out, though, that I think we do have to get back to, we do have a parking policy, and they're currently following it. So for me, that's where we're at. For the other proposal that we'll be dealing with today, the same thing applies. We have a parking policy, and they need to follow it. We should also be updating our parking policy to the notice of motion Councillor Skipsey has. I think that's going to be a very interesting conversation. I don't know where that will land, but right now, where they're at, they're following the OCP. They're asking for essentially a couple of variances, and we're making it a rezoning because of the short-term rentals. But they're following the policies we have laid out as a town, that we have set as essentially as a council, as a governing body, and to start changing it at the last second. Also, too, I worry about adding a lot of extra costs for this project because the bottom floor is a restaurant. Currently in Qualicum Beach, a third of our restaurants are either for sale or getting ready to shut down. So it's not a great time for restaurants in Qualicum Beach. So I hesitate to add more costs for something that is, like I do actually see in the long term, the idea of having a few restaurants near all our playing fields and the pool and our civic center is a great idea. You go to a meeting there, then you go to the tapas bar after your meeting in the civic center. I think it's going to be a great amenity actually for the town in the long run. So I hesitate at all these extra charges at the last second.
Thank you. Councillor Skipsey.
Yeah. Well, I guess if the motion to not allow the units to be sold off separately had gone ahead, I might feel differently about this. But currently, I believe that a lock-off unit could be owned by a different individual, and there would be no parking provided for that unit. So we actually have 3 different individual lock-off units that could be owned by separate owners, and there's no requirement for parking. And we don't even have really, I don't believe, as Councillor Vandervalk mentioned, a definition or guidance on how lock-offs are treated, or a policy even on how they work. So, you know, I would say most people who are arriving to stay in this lock-off unit won't be arriving by foot or by bicycle, and so we do need parking.
Thank you. There's been comments made that, you know, once you get to this stage, you can't make any changes. Well, what's the point then of having a public hearing? That's a rhetorical question. You have a public hearing, you hear from people, they make comments. We've heard comments about this and the other project about parking problems. So it's not unusual for us at this stage, after the public hearing, to listen to the public and they make comments for us to deal with that, to address them. So no, I don't feel bad about making changes at this stage, because that's why we have third reading and after the public hearing. So in this case, Mr. Sales, was there any comment from the owner or to the architect about this?
Not on this particular comment or request, Mayor Westbrook. The one thing I wanted to add, and apologies, I was thinking about 2 things at once, is Council may, between now and adoption, want to take a look at the 2021 parking study that was done, because it does have some insights into parking constraints and issues in different parts of town. This area of town, where, you know, which includes Jones Street and also the upper end of 2nd Avenue, does actually have a considerable amount of parking available. Peak parking utilization in this area was at 2 p.m. and it maxed out at 70% of on-street parking being utilized. So at 70%, there's still lots of spaces available. So I think it's absolutely correct that if these units were to be rented independent of the lock-off suites, there would be an extra vehicle generated. The assumption would be that they would find a place to park elsewhere. From this property to Jones Street is 100 feet. So it's not an extremely long walk. 100 feet would be, you know, approximately a 40-second walk, maybe. So In that context, the staff would not recommend requiring an additional parking stall. However, if council does want to adopt this motion for the purpose of contributing towards future off-street parking, communal parking areas, that's entirely within your discretion. But as a requirement for this project, they shouldn't have to include extra stalls. So slightly different areas, whether council wants to expect the contribution or whether the parking stall is required. But just wanted to give that context, and the parking study is available on the town website should you choose to review it in detail.
Thank you. Any further comments? I go up there quite often for different reasons, and I see there's a lot of cars more recently this year, parking in that vicinity by the bank and across in the different shops, and people all along Jones on the west side. There's a lot of parking, a lot of cars parked there. We know we have a parking problem, and we don't put these monies into a big black hole of a budget. We actually acquire properties in town, in this area, as we have just down the road on Beach and Fern on the corner. So we buy land. We don't calculate the value of the development of the house on it, but we look at the size of the property that we can buy for assessed value or near there, and then figure out how many parking spots we can get on them, and that's how we come up with a number. It's pretty straightforward. So I think in this case, if there are going to be lock-up suites, I agree with Councillor Skipsey that there could easily be 2 cars per unit. And I think we need to look ahead at parking, and we're going to be short. It'd be nice if we didn't need parking. I know there are areas in the province where I think Victoria is looking at no parking requirements at all, but I don't think that's realistic in Qualicum Beach. So I will vote in favor of this this requirement. So on number D, ready for the question? All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. And the last one, Councillor Skipsey.
Well, I think this one was raised with the previous, with the C. So anyways, a maximum of 2 adults are permitted in each bedroom, and this is consistent with our bed and breakfast regulations, I believe, and other Airbnb regulations. And there was, not that long ago, I guess, a fire in Montreal in a vacation rental where there were people that never made it out. And so I think it's basically a safety issue.
Is there a seconder for that? Councillor Van der Waal, discussion. Councillor Harrison.
As someone who lived in Montreal for 8 years, and I was a student, so I was not in high-end housing. I was in quite the opposite. My last place had a space for a dumbwaiter, and there were rats in the building, and I had 3 separate water leaks in the last 6 months. If there's a fire in an old building that's being used as an Airbnb, it's probably because of the building, not because of the use. There are irresponsible Airbnb tenants, just like there are irresponsible people everywhere, but I don't see the causality between a fire being caused by short-term rentals. I see it's more likely that it's probably a very old building that caught fire because someone was a little bit negligent. So I don't see why we'd be doing this.
Thank you. Councillor Young.
As discussed before, it would be a hard thing for us to regulate. And as a single parent, like at Christmas time, my children were home, and we had more than 2 people asleep in the living room. So I just like I agree with Councillor Harrison that it's the fire regulations in the unit. It is not how many people is in the units. That
Thank you.
would be a problem.
Councillor Svenvold, any comment?
Only that I believe that when you're if you were in a hotel, there is a limit to the number of people that you can have in a room, is there not? So in some situations, I suppose. So I don't know that this is a particularly new idea.
Well, we've stayed, talking about people staying in hotels, we've gone with our children and they get adults now, obviously. We have stayed in Vancouver, and now there was large rooms, but we did have more than 2 adults. They were all family staying in the same room, and it was a lot of fun. And Dad had to go down to the swimming pool to have his shower, because otherwise I'd be waiting a long time. But I think to regulate this, I don't support this. I think people use common sense, and if there's a situation where you have a special occasion, there may be a cot or something showing up, but I don't have a problem with that, so I'm not going to support this particular item. Thank you. Ready for the question? All in favor? Opposed? Motion fails. Thank you.
Sorry, Council Vandervalk, were you in favor or opposed? Thank you.
Okay. So, Councillor Skipsey.
Well, there was one more motion then arising from the first one, the step code one being rejected. So that would be that the building is required to be built with either PV solar on the roof and/or green roof. And I would so move.
Thank you. Seconder? Councillor Harrison, seconded. Mr. Sales, was there any, you mentioned before, what was the comment from the, excuse me, from the owners or through the architect?
Thank you, Mayor Westbrook. So through the application process, the architect has indicated that the roof would be green. This would be in line with that. So if council wants to ensure that that requirement or that statement is followed through, then it would be appropriate. And allowing the flexibility to do solar PV instead of the green roof does allow a bit of flexibility. So it's certainly reasonable to consider at this time.
Thank you. So it was moved and seconded. Discussion. Councillor Harrison.
And I just also suggest if we're going to do this moving forward, instead of and/or, just have or, because if you have a whole bunch of solar panels, it's going to be hard to have things growing in the shadow of all the solar panels. Yeah, just I think it should be an either or, and they can choose whichever one. It seems from the comments of staff that this was earlier contemplated. I think we also require all buildings to be have the electrical hookups for photovoltaic. Is that correct? Correct me if I'm wrong.
Very close. Through the chair to Councillor Harrison, it's for solar hot water that residential dwellings are required to be adaptable to it. In the context of a mixed-use building, I don't know exactly how that translates, but certainly, a typical house construction, yes, they're required to be adaptable to solar hot water because the town joined that legislation approximately 10 years ago.
Okay, so yeah, I think you have residential suites on top. To your point, though, it's sort of a flat roof. Ironically, makes it better for solar. But I just think having in the either or, they've indicated they're fine with that. I think that's not an unreasonable request.
Thank you. And I know from our architect, Mr. Jensen, when he built his house on College Road, I think he was completely off the grid, or could be, and could probably feed the grid from all the power you collected with your photovoltaic and with your solar panels. So I think you're an expert in trying to be energy efficient. So with that, further discussion. All in favor? Opposed, if any? Carried unanimously. Thank you. So that leaves us to the end of this particular development. Councillor Vandervalk.
I don't have any official motions, but I do have a question regarding the project. Mr. Sales mentioned that there will be a heat pump on the roof, and that was one of the concerns of one of the people that spoke at the public hearing. And I'm just wondering if we have anything in place for a requirement that there be noise mitigation for those heat pumps, because we have received correspondence from other people in the town about noise from heat pumps in general. And this one, if it's on the roof of the building, I think perhaps we should try and do something about that.
Mr. Sales?
Thank you. Through the chair to Councillor Vandervalk. Currently, there are no requirements regarding noise attenuation for rooftop mechanical equipment. I say mechanical equipment because the same issues exist regardless of whether it's a heat pump or a traditional mechanical system. they generate noise, and any of these rooftop units would potentially be an issue. The reason that in this case it's likely not to be an impact on the neighbor is that this building is essentially comparable in height, right? And so the sound generated on one is likely to go essentially over the other and not directly into a window where it would potentially cause a conflict. Having said that, I would be happy to ask for a little bit of clarification on the rooftop units particularly, and if that would be useful, I can provide that at the next meeting. Thank you.
You. Were you finished?
No, not yet.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I think also it's not just how it would affect the neighboring building, but the noise, the noise throughout the surrounding area, because I think there have been problems with previous buildings where there hasn't been any mitigation for mechanical noise, and that might be something to consider because we were also thinking about a noise bylaw, so that might be part of it.
Thank you. And our staff indicated you'll get back to us for the next meeting, adoption. Councillor Harrison.
I just want to point out too that there's different types of heat pumps. I think there's at least 2, and I think there's 3 different types of heat pumps that are available that you can buy, and the newer ones don't have the same noise characteristics as some of the older units. So it might be something too where you want to check what heat pump are you actually dealing with. Beyond that too, for Mr. Sales to frame it with mechanical noise on a rooftop, I read that as getting ready for some of the developments we're going to be seeing, particularly with Naked Naturals, the interaction between their systems and then the neighboring homes. But we'd want that to be done through a policy that's consistent, not as a series of one-offs. And I also have a hunch that the heat pumps can be a lot quieter than all the refrigeration and everything else for a grocery store. So I don't see the need to do anything for this property yet, but it might be a good thing to get the information before adoption, just what they're looking at. But I would highlight too, I remember reading a report on CBC about 6 months ago about heat pumps, and they did specifically mention that some of the complaints are generated by units from about 15 years ago, and you just want to make sure what you're actually getting and what the characteristics are these days.
Thank you. And from my experience, my neighbor had a heat pump, and it was very noisy. New people moved in, got a new heat pump, you don't hear a thing. So the new technology is much better, more efficient and quieter. So, and you'll get back to us on as far as the noise. So we've gone through all the different motions, and we've moved first and for third reading. We have moved and seconded, but we haven't voted on it. So could I ask, are you ready for the question? All in favor? Opposed? Carried. And you saw the hands opposed. Councillor Skipsey and Councillor Van der Valk opposed? Yeah, okay. Yes. It was a very quiet yes. Okay. So the other one, 172, and the reason why we're having this meeting today, because last week there was a question about the minutes not being available, and for some people the public hearing on tape wasn't, for some people, difficulty to get. But rather than waiting for the 230 Second Avenue for another month, it wouldn't be till July, we thought it was unreasonable, and so that's why we're having a meeting today. In the meantime, we had another public hearing on the 15th of June, and I suggested that we could consider this development as well, but it's not in the same category, so to speak. We have more time for this. This wouldn't have come to this reading until July, to the July meeting. So I would like to ask council if you want to have move first and have it moved and seconded, and then have any questions or comments. So if we're not going ahead, at least we know kind of what the issues are. So could I have a motion to move third reading on 172? Councillor Young, seconded. Discussion. Councillor Harrison.
Yeah, so just for this again, just because the parking issue is raised, I just want to check through the chair to staff. Are they following the existing parking policy in terms of the number of parking spots, or is there additional contribution that needs to be made?
Mr. Sales.
Thank you. Through the chair to Councillor Harrison. They do meet the parking requirement. The residential parking requirement is 1 stall per residential unit, 8 units, 8 parking stalls. Thank you.
Further comments, questions? All right. Councillor Skipsey.
Well, we talked about perhaps getting some clarification around third reading versus the development permit. They're two separate things, and perhaps, especially for the newer councillors, just that process. And I do have a couple of things that I would like considered prior to the issuance of a development permit.
Mr. Sales, can you clarify the issue of moving ahead with the zoning so the owners know that they're going to have the zoning and they're going to be able to do something, but some of the specifics are perhaps not clear yet?
Thank you, Mayor Westbrook. Yes, that's a good item to explain a little bit more. So, as council knows, we're considering a zoning amendment, which is changing the potential land use on the property from residential 14 to a higher density residential, more infill land use. So that's one thing. So council is considering whether the density and setbacks and whatnot are appropriate to this site. So the other item that council is considering is the development permit. That development permit is in relation to the the design guidelines and the development permit area. So that's the point where council is really considering the development detail, like how the building looks, how the building functions, how it interacts with the neighboring properties. Oftentimes we consider the two together, but they can be split up. So if council did want to advance the land use, saying, yes, this is the right spot, this is the type of development we want, but we want more time to work on the design details for this, then council absolutely could advance the land use independent of the development permit. Thank you.
In this situation, I would suggest that we have third reading on the zoning, so that's approved, and then we can still debate some of the issues before we move ahead with the rest. So I move that we proceed with third reading on the zoning of this particular property. Could I have a seconder for that? Councillor Harrison? Sorry.
Sorry, we have a motion on the floor already. Moved Councillor Harrison, seconded
yes.
Councillor Young for
Okay.
third reading.
Okay, so how would we split this then, if it's already on the floor?
Thank you, Mayor Westbrook. The development permit is not actually being considered today, at a technical level, so there's no recommendation regarding the development permit. That would usually happen at the time of adoption. So if council is intending to split the two processes, technically there's no need to do anything different today. You can move with the zoning amendment. However, it would be appropriate to at least let the developer know that that's likely to be the path moving forward, and that's really just a courtesy as much as anything else. So if it is council's intention to split these two processes and advance the zoning amendment independent of the development permit, I would recommend a motion just to clarify that that's the path we're going down so that everyone's expectations are clear moving forward. Thank you.
Yes, I understand, but so now we have this motion on the floor, and if we just wanted to proceed with the zoning to give the owners some comfort that, they're on the right track, do I have to amend the motion? We can just make this as, this would clarify that? Councilor, Ms. Svensson?
Yes, sorry, the motion on the floor now is just for the rezoning for
Okay.
third reading.
Thank you.
Yes.
Wonderful. So can we proceed with that part and then continue with the other discussion on the specifics? Councilor Harrison.
I'm just kind of confused because this is residential infill. There's no commercial component. Usually we're doing a separate DP process when there's a very complicated commercial proposal. So Naked Naturals is one example, right? So we did the zoning and then we're going to do the DP. But for residential infill, I don't recall ever doing this. And this is just strictly residential infill. So I'm confused why we'd have essentially two approval processes with unknown requirements for the second one, when that's not how we've done any residential infill in the last 5 years, certainly. And I'm trying hard to think of any residential project in there ever, for all the council meetings I've attended, where you have a separation between the rezoning and the development permit. Commercial buildings, sure, there's a fair debate there, but I've never seen it for residential.
And that's why I asked for explanation and clarification, because it is unusual. So I would, the motion is there, and I think if council has any concerns about the development as proposed, let's talk about that. So any concerns with the project as presented? Councilor Skipsey.
Well, it won't be a big surprise that I would like to see the building achieve Step Code 4, Step 4 of the BC Energy Step Code. Again, I understand it to be a Part 9 building, so Step Code 3 would be the minimum. So I think it's reasonable for council to ask for something a little bit beyond that. And Councillor Harrison raised it earlier that there is work, council will be working on this. I have been trying to push that we have a presentation around step codes and whatnot, and have been told that the RDN is working on this as more of a regional approach. I certainly feel a certain amount of urgency about getting this done and getting things in place, so I would hope that that happens at this table sooner rather than later. The other thing that we heard was the interior space, and that was a comment from the APC when the building came forward, and I noticed in the plans, it's still similar that somebody would park at the back of the building, and then if they're coming through the back of the building, they enter through a bedroom into the unit. And so I'm just wondering, the wording of the APC was the interior space be reconsidered to be more functional. But maybe we need to elaborate on that to say more functional access from the rear of the property or something. My concern is that people would then not park in the back and want to park more at the front of the property, because that's where the front entrance to the kitchen and the living space and whatnot would be. I do have concerns about issuing a variance for the property. And that would be through the development permit, I believe. Well, it could be through the rezoning or the development permit. That was brought up, I thought, quite articulately by one of the speakers at the public hearing around variances, and the question was around how often they are granted, because then what's the point sort of thing if you're going to always allow for variances. The other thing that was mentioned by the proponent or the representative was about the ground floor maybe being wheelchair accessible. And I know from having served on various accessibility committees in the past that finding suitable accommodation can be very difficult for people in wheelchairs in this community. And so my preference would be to see that one of the ground floor units be designed to be fully accessible for wheelchairs. And then finally, that the same permeable paver material that was stated would be used in patio and the walkway areas, ensuring that that is also used in the breezeway to allow for water egress. And I think that's the right word, permeable surfaces anyways. And then at one time, the Director of Planning had suggested that a Section 219 form and character covenant be registered to ensure that the property is developed in accordance with the submitted plans. And I would be intending to bring that forward at the next meeting, or when the development permit is considered.
Thank you. Councillor Harrison.
I think the form and character isn't unreasonable. It's basically saying, here's what you gave us, and you're just expected to do it. Fair enough. I would point out, though, on the variances, one of the issues is that you have our overarching document as our OCP. Below that, you have the zoning, and there is a gap between the two. So when we update our OCP, we don't update the zoning in the same areas. And so it's hard to reject something which lines up with the OCP. Because you've essentially inherited zoning that might be from 30 or 40 years ago. So for example, we were looking at another commercial property who wanted to do short-term rentals, and someone said, well, it's not listed in the zoning as an acceptable use, but it turns out the zoning was written in the 1990s when short-term rentals didn't exist. So one of the issues with variances being issued is that you're essentially catching up to your overarching planning documents, which do periodically get updated. So for the RDN, it's your regional growth strategy. For the town, it's our OCP. And there's a gap between other aspects of our zoning which hasn't caught up to that. So that's one of the big reasons why you do variances. The other thing too is just sometimes every different site is different. So sometimes there's a lot of steep grade, and so something is technically over height, but that's just how it works on the property. So variances can either be, one, you're catching up to what the vision of the community is, or two, there's site-specific considerations which you're trying to be reasonable with. And for example, we had last meeting a variance for 4 inches. So I don't think anyone would say, how dare they go 4 inches in a, what was it, like an 8-meter setback or something like that? I don't think many people would be too upset, but that's why it's necessary, because technically they do have to comply. As far as step 3 versus step 4 for type 9, we did have some feedback earlier from both Ruth Fleming-Smith and Walter Hoogland, 2 people who are kind of familiar with the process, that it's not a huge imposition. I would worry a lot about jumping to step 5, because I know where the RDN is going is the zero carbon building, I think is where they're trying to do. That for now I think would be a little bit more aspirational than requirement, but it is where the step code is eventually going anyways. And then accessibility to making units accessible is something you want to clarify early on. It has a lot of implications for all the hallways, the washrooms. It's not just sort of the entrance, it's a lot of different parts of the building. So I'd be really hesitant to sort of throw that in at this stage, because it would require them to basically redesign probably at least 1 floor, possibly 2 of the building. And that, I'm just very cautious about that. And I'd want to get maybe some feedback from our town planner, like if we're looking at that, should we maybe perhaps do that through a process which applies to everyone as opposed to a one-off for this building? And what would be the imposition in terms of the actual building itself and the layout? Thank you.
So we've got a list that Councillor Skipsey mentioned, and perhaps because it's been moved and seconded, well, we can perhaps put on, if that's the right term, some requirements, and we'll take them one at a time. The first one was to achieve step code 4. So is there a motion? I accept it as a motion, Councillor Skipsey, from you. Is there a seconder to require step code 4 for this particular project? Okay, so step code 4, so it's been seconded. Discussion on that particular item. Councillor Skipsey.
Well, I'm just wondering if this is the appropriate time to do this, or whether it would be when the development permit comes before council.
Well, this is, I think, an indication to the owner,
Okay.
to the things that we're looking for. They have time. This wouldn't have appeared on the agenda until July meeting, but I think it's good in advance for them to know that we approved the zoning, the number of units allowed on the site, and here are some of the things that we would be looking for. So I thought I'd just go through one at a time, because we did that with the previous one, and I think it's a good discussion to have. It was moved and seconded to require step code 4. Any further discussion? All in favor? Carries. Thank you. The next one, where you wanted an interior redesign, I think you mentioned. So I take there's a motion. Can you perhaps clarify that a little bit more, Councillor Skipsey?
Well, that the interior space be reconsidered to provide more functional access from the rear of the property is the wording that I had come up with.
Okay. Well, because you use the word considered, I think that's reasonable, so I'll second that. Discussion. All in favor? Opposed? Carries. Thank you. Was there someone opposed? Were you opposed? Okay, Councillor Harrison was opposed to that. Then the issue of variances, and we had a discussion. Councillor Harrison made his comments. Any further comments about variances? And I need a seconder to basically not allow variances, but perhaps you could speak to that first, as to what extent you want to go. Councillor Skipsey.
Yeah, my wording was a design that would not require a variance, a 1.5 meter variance for side yard setback. I think that's where it's being asked for. And to Councillor Harrison's point, the R20 zone, which is what we're looking at here, was actually originally designed, I believe, for the affordable housing. So that's not old. And it was used also, I understand, on Railway Street. So that's not that long ago either. So I mean, I think it's fairly current, and there's a reason why it's required on, 1.5 on one side, 3 on the other, for a total of 4.5 is my understanding. It's the standard, and I think at one time it was in order to be able to get a vehicle through on the property. I'm not sure.
Okay. So did we have a seconder on this one? I didn't think we have one. You seconded? Okay. Now we can have a more discussion. So Councillor Harrison, go ahead.
I just point out, if you look at our agenda, when it looks at the existing zoning, that's R14. That's the actual existing zoning. The interior side setback on R14 is 1.5 meters. The development permit proposal is 1.5 meters. So it's actually, the problem with the R20 is that it's not designed for every single property in all of Qualicum Beach, but it actually is the exact same setback as what they currently have under the zoning.
Mr. Sales, any comment on that?
Yes, thank you. Councilor Harrison is correct that the existing residential 14 zone has a minimum side yard setback of 1.5 meters, as does the proposed development. I think that the confusing part here is that, Council has heard in previous meetings, some concern about the proliferation of new zones at every zoning amendment application, right? Why are you writing a new zone? Why are you writing a new zone? So, I'll confess that there is an intention of staff to reuse zones wherever appropriate. However, those zones, as Councilor Harrison noted, sometimes don't reflect the actual site, and they require some tweaking, which is exactly why the OCP identifies that setback variances may be required for architectural interest and other features. So, in this case, there's 2 points there. One is it is the same as the existing zone. It's just not the same as the R20 zone, but the R20 zone was the closest fit to the proposal before you today. So it didn't fit exactly on the side yard setback, which is why the variance is required. Stepping back in time, council could very well have written a site-specific zone exactly for this. But there is a possibility where we would end up with 900 zones in the zoning bylaw, which is really not to anyone's benefit in the long term. So that's just a little bit of context as to why the R20 zone was used and also how it compares to the existing R14 zone. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that clarification. I really appreciate that. So on the variances, we just mentioned variances, but is there a particular direction you want to go with this motion to let the owners know what is required if it passes? Personally, based on the explanation that was given, I don't have a problem with the variances for this location. So, but if we can take a vote on it to make sure that that's what we want to do. So, Councillor Skipsey, I'll give you a moment to tell us exactly what you have in mind to change in this regard.
No, I think the explanation from the Director of Planning helped clarify why the variance is needed, or why it's there.
Okay, so the simplest thing for us is to vote on it and just, Ms. Svensson.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that I had the wording correct, that council instructs staff to notify the proponent that the design would not be permitted, that would require a 1.5 variance from the side lot setback.
That was the idea, yeah.
Okay.
That's what we're voting on. So are you ready for the question? All in favor? Opposed? Motion fails. Thank you. The next one was having one unit to be accessible. So, Councillor Skipsey.
Yeah, so the original wording that I had was that council directs staff to inform the applicant of 172 Fern Road West that issuance of the development permit will be considered after the applicant has addressed the following design issues. And the one being one ground floor unit designed to be fully accessible. And I guess we need a seconder for that. Looking to Petra now. Thank you. Yeah, I just think that we need to be providing homes for people in wheelchairs in our community. And there aren't a lot of units where people, this is a ground floor access, so it's ideal from that perspective. And I think that it can be a real struggle for people to find units, and perhaps, I don't know if it's through a pre-sale or, I just think if required, or if if there is, could be an opportunity to offer that in the community, I think it would be a welcome change.
And I think it's a lot easier to design it when it's not constructed yet than trying to make them accessible afterwards. Mr. Sales, any comment on this particular requirement?
Thank you, Mayor Westbrook. The BC Building Code does include some provisions and requirements for accessibility. The area outside, the landscaping, and the way that those wheelchair users would access the site, that does require a bit more consideration. So if council's okay with it, I'd like to reach out to the proponent to find out what accessibility features or issues they're going to be dealing with in the later design stages. So if it's okay, I'd like to go away and get a little bit more information and provide it to council at the next consideration.
Would it be okay if I defer it till the next meeting?
Yes, actually, I was going to ask you, I think you chaired a meeting this week, accessibility. So where would they be going with something like this?
Well, this is getting ahead of a report for the next meeting. Basically, I feel personally that you should really look at Whistler's accessibility plan. It's not what we're going to be able to do. We have a legislative requirement to come up with an accessibility plan by September 1st. So obviously that's going to be very rushed. But I do hope we start looking over the next 2 or 3 years, having the actual resources to do basically what Whistler did. And they look at all aspects of public spaces, also how they look at how buildings are going to be designed. The other thing I'd point out too is that there's rumors I've heard from people who are involved. The gentleman, if you remember, I think you were at the Adam Walker thing where Luke from Arise in Victoria was there. So he's said that the new iteration of the BC Building Code, public submissions for that stopped on June 16th, so it should be tabled next year, has significant accessibility provisions in it. So there's going to be a lot of things which are going to line up with that. My only consideration for this, the reason why I want to defer is just that sorry, I should only speak to the deferral. I really want to get that feedback, like, is this actually possible? And if the developer says, yes, this is not an issue, we can do that, great. And if the developer says, oh my gosh, we're gonna have to redesign the entire building, well, then that might not be appropriate.
A motion to defer would be in order. Motion to defer, seconded by Councillor Skipsey. Discussion on the deferment. All in favor? Motion carries. Thank you. So that one, Councillor, Ms. Sales, we look to you to see if that's a big deal for the owner. But my question to Councillor Harrison was, do you think this accessibility direction will affect private developments?
I think it's going to be done through the BC Building Code, respectfully. I think the government already has some language. So I know for the St. Andrews Lodge building, that's been a concern, like how much accessibility they have to have in those washrooms. But moving forward, I think it's going to be a pretty strong requirement for residential construction. If not, that's also something we could set as a town. We could say, in excess of X number of units, Y number of units need to be accessible. And then we have a policy that applies to all new construction, and everyone knows going in what you're dealing with.
Thank you. So the last item that you raised, Councillor Skipsey, was permeable surfaces. So would you make a motion to that effect?
Yes, so I guess, well, the preamble is that council directs staff to inform the applicant that the following be considered. Sorry, I'm I'm losing it. Anyways, I'll just get to this part of it. That the same permeable paver material used in patio and walkway areas also be used in the breezeways. And yeah, we'll get a second.
Seconder, Councillor Van der Waal. Go ahead.
And my concern was just about the site coverage, and I know it's only 56%, and I get that, but it seems like there's a lot of impervious surfaces between the roof and the carports and whatnot, and I would just like to see the breezeway be also permeable.
Seconded, Mr. Sales. Is that a big deal?
Thank you, Mayor Westbrook. So that is the type of fine point that council would be considering the development permit. So, if that is important to council, forecasting it at this time would be appropriate.
Yeah, sorry, I'll just say I'm in favor of this. I think it's, especially in the areas, and we've seen the effect of the atmospheric rivers when they land. A lot of water, all of a sudden comes in, and I think to have as much permeable material around these developments, I think is an advantage. So I will support asking staff to work with the owner to try and achieve that. Councillor Harrison.
I'd point out just two things. One, permeable surfaces and accessibility sometimes don't line up. So you want to be careful about that. There can be issues, particularly over time, as the surface becomes more uneven. Secondly, I do recall our town engineer saying that intrinsic to the development, there's a significant amount of consideration for stormwater already. So we might want to review those comments or have the town engineer here to speak about that more broadly. I think it's a good conversation, but I think also too with the accessibility lens being deferred, we might want to consider those two things together. Are there potential impacts? And if not, well, okay, that's one conversation. But if there are, I'd hate us to have one resolution that sort of gets in the way of the other.
I think Mr. Sales understands this. We're trying to be on a leading edge in a sense with new development as far as what we anticipate with climate change. And so I think having you speak with the architect and the owners about these concerns, both about accessibility and permeable material, I think is a reasonable conversation to have. But I don't think we're forcing that at this point, but we're saying, please consider that and come back with a proposal that would make it better from an environmental perspective. So with that, further discussion, Councillor Harrison.
I'm just looking at our corporate officer's face as she's looking at the resolution. Can we just get clarity? Is it a request for a debate, or is it a request for like a hard requirement?
No, I think it's a request for a conversation, for staff to
Yeah,
convey.
staff to inform the applicant the following be considered.
Yeah.
That the same permeable surfaces.
Yeah, that's good wording. So with that, further discussion. All in favor? Opposed, if any? So on the main motion, with all these considerations, go ahead.
Can we discuss some other points as well before
Certainly.
we? Okay. And I can't remember if Councillor Skipsey did mention about the flow. Have we just voted on that or discussed that? Okay. I think in the last presentation that we had from the developer, that they had mentioned solar panels, the possibility of solar panels, or maybe that was someone at the public hearing suggested that it might be a good idea for solar panels. I would like to suggest that, either that or, again, low impact solution, which might be a light colored roof as opposed to a dark colored roof, so that it's not a big, because it's quite a large roof and could be a heat sink. I know at the public hearing there was a lot of concern about parking, and I know that the developer is at the required number of parking stalls at this time. That may be changing, but that they are meeting the requirements. But I think that there likely will be more cars than they are providing parking for among the owners. And I just would suggest that the town do something about limiting the time that people can park on the street in front of that development, because likely most people are going to park there because they have more cars, and that they'll be bringing their groceries in from the front rather than from the back garage area or parking area. And I think that's all. I don't really have any. Oh, also the R20 zoning is for the gables at Village Way and Memorial. And that has an underground parking area. Essentially, that was the reason why it needed to be, it was deemed that it needed to be 4 stories at the back so that they could get the parking in there. So likely they to have the same requirement of one parking stall per unit, I'm assuming, regardless of the size. So I think that we also do need to look at, and this is not based on the proposal, but we need to look at how our parking requirements are established.
Your first comment about solar and that, I think because we passed a requirement to look at step code 4, I think that's included in that. And parking, I think that's a separate issue where we can, because I know in Sunningdale, people have parking in the back, but they all park in the front. So it's probably going to happen here. And the owner across the street made some very valid arguments about us providing more parking, and parking in the back of the building when all the traffic will come from the front may not be realistic. So having some parking limits, we can put it on after, but I don't think that's a necessary part of this proposal at this stage. Councillor Harrison.
I just want to point out too, the only land purchase in the previous term was for one small family lot on Fern, specifically because eventually it might become more useful as parking. So this is something that, literally within a couple blocks, that is sort of the long-term plan for that lot at the time we purchased it, was that it might eventually become parking. So it's not that there hasn't been any consideration of that. Obviously, with Naked Naturals, there's going to be a big change with the bus garage property, and that's going to filter along Fern. So we want to be cognizant of that. But I will come back to, this is the sort of thing that our OCP calls for. And we want to shift away in our downtown from being car dependent. So they're following the rules. Having debate about the parking policy is entirely valid, but I'd hesitate to give them extra requirements beyond the existing policies we have, because that's sort of the ground framework when they walked into this. And I'd hate to change it, and then we have another debate and change it again, and it just gets really complicated that way.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, Your Worship, if there was direction coming out of Councillor Vandervalk's address or not, because we haven't recorded and we have no motions.
No, I'm fully aware that there's no motions, but I think some of the items are separate, already being covered by having that first motion regarding step code 4, so we've covered that. Parking, I think we can look at parking regulations and enforcement for 2 hour maximum in that area at certain times. I think we can deal with that. So there's been no motion to direct staff for anything. It's just conversation right now, and I think it's okay to get a feel of what council think about this project. So any further comments? Councillor Skipsey.
Well, I'd just like to add to the conversation that we heard at the public hearing a suggestion for a green roof on the carport, and I really liked that idea. I thought that was a good use of that space, so I would encourage that.
Thank you. Well, I think we've had a pretty good run at this. I'm sure glad that we didn't have both of these at a future council meeting. It would be a very long council meeting. But this is good to focus on this, think about it, and we've had good feedback in the public hearings and other communications. So I'm ready for voting on for third reading, unless there's further discussion. Are you ready for the question? All in favor? Opposed, if any? Carried. Thank you. That concludes today's meeting. We just need a motion to adjourn. Councillor Vandervalk, Councillor Young. Okay, we are adjourned. Thank you. And thank you for staying with us this time. And I hope you enjoyed having this debate. That's not too detailed, but I think this is good governance, where we look at every issue and take our time to consider all of them. Thank you.